Chief Resilience Officer here at the City of St. Paul in Mayor Carter's office, where I work on climate action and sustainability across the city's enterprise, including things like transit. Thanks again for joining us. And I'm joined here today by several colleagues from both the City of St. Paul and Metro Transit, as well as MnDOT. And I think we'll skip doing intros for everyone, but all the folks who are here from those agencies may help answer questions as we get toward the end. So appreciate everyone's time today. So launching in here, we're really excited to talk to you about this concept for a new West 7th corridor in St. Paul that would connect downtown St. Paul to the Mall of America through the neighborhoods along West 7th. This concept is really the result of some intensive work between the city, Metro Transit, and MnDOT over the last several months to come up with a way to move forward with a pretty significant and transformative transit improvement in the West 7th corridor that will also reinvest in the street and in other kind of multimodal options for moving around the community. We are very much still staying in touch with our friends and partners at Ramsey County through this process, but it's the three agencies that I mentioned who have been doing the work to date. And we look forward to getting your preliminary feedback. We're at that level of concept here, and many of the questions may be at the level of detail that we aren't at yet, but we welcome all questions and all feedback through this process. That's why we're doing this.
Russ, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm struggling a little bit with advancing my slides and accidentally muted myself. So we're going to be about 20 minutes of presentation. We'll get into Q&A and then briefly at the end talk about some next steps. I apologize, my slides are slow. Okay, here we go. So as I mentioned, a new multimodal approach for the West 7th corridor, making sure I didn't skip a slide. And this concept really builds on many years of work that was led by Ramsey County with the city, Metro Transit, and others at the table in thinking about how to improve transit in this corridor. Through that process, we all learned a lot from you and many others in the community about some of the kind of pitfalls and challenges of trying to think about how to fit all the things in this corridor that we might ultimately like to fit. We heard certainly through those processes about business concerns, about the potential loss of street parking. We know that any big construction project has impacts on businesses on the street, and of course are mindful of those potentials. In particular, we know that along West 7th, probably the busiest single area of retail activity is that area between the Xcel Energy Center and United and Children's Hospitals, where especially around events, but even on non-event days, there's lots of activity, lots of people accessing those businesses, moving around. And probably the area with the highest demand for street parking along the entirety of West 7th. And so we'll show you shortly a concept that we came up with for trying to avoid some of those conflicts around trying to move transit quickly through that section of West 7th. In particular, the idea here is that we would move a bus rapid transit line up to Smith Avenue between Kellogg and 7th to avoid some of that congestion in that area between the arena and the hospital. Second, in terms of potential for parking loss, which is an issue all the time on commercial corridors in cities. In order to mitigate the potential for parking loss with a substantial improvement to transit, we're looking at for the area kind of moving further west along the corridor. And I'll use the direction west and east to refer to moving either toward kind of, the airport and the Mall of America or toward downtown St. Paul, even though the street, as you know, is at a diagonal. And then I'll refer to the north side of the street and the south side of the street. And if that ends up confusing folks, let us know, and we'll try to clarify that later. But in terms of thinking about the potential for parking loss, so for that area between the hospital approximately and 35E, today there's street parking on both sides. This concept would include one direction of dedicated busway along West 7th Street, and that would allow us to keep street parking on one side of the street or the other for the most part. Overall, the concept would keep a little bit more than half of the street parking that is out there today. We heard through, over the years, concerns about potential impacts to the Highway 5 bridge. This particularly came up in the context of the conversation about streetcar. Because of the limitations of that bridge and the tunnel under Fort Snelling, there were scenarios that we're going to have to go down to one lane of car traffic on the Highway 5 bridge. This particular concept doesn't change the nature of the Highway 5 bridge in any way, wouldn't require dedicated space for buses across that bridge. We know that in terms of making transit work well for people, two of the keys are the speed at which it operates, and maybe even more importantly, the reliability. So the consistency with which transit can move, relatively efficiently across the community, so that when you're getting on a bus about how much time it's going to take you to get to your destination, so that the schedule can be relatively predictable. And so one of the key ways that we're looking at doing that is by dedicating about half of the corridor for space that would be exclusively for buses, but also in some cases for emergency vehicles, which can always use these dedicated lanes, as well as right turning movements. And some of the things that I'm describing, we'll have some visuals in the coming slides that will make that more clear. In terms of the Highway 5 bridge, I mentioned no changes, and so really no impacts there. No changes or impacts to the archaeological and important kind of cultural heritage sites, including native and indigenous sacred sites in the Fort Snelling area, because the project doesn't propose making any capital changes to that area. And so those are some of the ways in which we're responding to a sort of known set of issues and challenges along the corridor. So the city, Metro Transit, and MnDOT came together in this effort to work on these shared goals. One is to make a generational investment in West 7th Street. We all who live, work, play, or get anywhere near West 7th Street know that it's the condition of the pavement, in many cases the condition of the sidewalks, are really in need of reinvestment, and that is independent of the need for better transit. The street really just needs some love and attention. We also know that there's a strong desire to have better, faster, more reliable, safe transit, as I mentioned, as well as to improve safety more broadly along the West 7th corridor, and things like calming traffic to make sure that it's safe not just for the movement of automobiles and transit vehicles, but of course for pedestrians and cyclists either using the corridor or going across the corridor. We certainly all agree about the idea of this investment supporting economic development along the corridor, adding to the thriving commercial districts that we already have, understanding that there's already a lot of kind of relative thriving going on in sections of the corridor. We want this investment to continue that trend of investment and reinvestment in the community, more business, more activity, more people, more housing, et cetera. We want to improve tree canopy and green space. This is an issue we've heard a lot from people over the years, that they care about those things as people who live, work, and play along the corridor. I mentioned protecting natural and cultural and historic resources. And some really key ones here at the end of the slide, developing a cost-competitive project that can build local and regional support. And the idea of there's been a lot of conversation over many years. This is a complex place to try to do a transit project. But I think we all want to see an investment happen sooner rather than later. So how do we come to a concept that can move forward relatively quickly? Obviously, community feedback remains an important part of this process, but we also want to keep things moving along. So here's the first kind of visual, and I'll start here on the downtown end of the corridor, which you can see here in blue on the right side of the screen. And this is an easy description because we don't propose to make any changes really in the downtown area. The idea here is that a bus rapid transit on this corridor would use the recently constructed stations for the new Gold Line bus rapid transit project that goes east from downtown out to Woodbury. Moving west, I mentioned Smith Avenue. So in pink here, you see the section of the corridor along Smith. So the buses would, starting from downtown, go on 6th Street and jog up to Smith rather than staying on 7th to avoid some of those, as I mentioned, kind of heavy congestion, lots of street parking area between the arena and the hospitals. In order to keep buses moving on Smith, this concept looks at having dedicated bus lanes in both directions on Smith. Because Smith isn't very wide in that area, that would also mean car travel going down to one direction on Smith, so one-way car travel, and that would be in the westbound or southbound direction out of downtown. I'll have another slide later that will kind of give you even more of a specific visual of some of these things. And we're very much talking to United and Children's hospitals about this concept. So continuing to move west, the orange section, kind of the heart of the West 7th neighborhood, the Fort Road community. I mentioned earlier, but the idea here would be in this section to have a dedicated bus lane in one direction and not in the other. So that means in the westbound direction or toward the airport, there'd be a dedicated bus lane. But in the eastbound direction, there wouldn't. So the bus would be just in the travel lane with cars. That would allow us to keep parking on one side of the street in this section because we know that some street parking is really important to the business community in this area. Continuing to move west, we come to this little green section where West 7th crosses Interstate 35E. This is one of the higher traffic sections of West 7th Street because of the interchange with the interstate. And so in order to keep the buses moving, again, the idea here would be dedicated bus lanes in both directions across the 35E bridge. That would require, in order to keep traffic flowing for vehicles and the interchange, that would require a little bit of a widening of the 7th Street Bridge over I-35, which is feasible and working with MnDOT on that concept. Continuing west, this is one of the kind of newer ideas being brought forward as part of this concept. And that is the idea of the bus would then jog down toward the Canadian Pacific rail spur that's existed for a very long time that runs between West 7th and Shepherd Road. And so in this kind of pink section here between approximately Montreal Avenue and St. Paul Avenue, a couple of reasons why we think it might be beneficial for the bus to jog down there. The first one is that that section of West 7th, as many of you know, between West 7th and Shepherd Road has lots of businesses. There's industry there. There's housing. It's really a mixture of community uses going on, but on the other side of the street, going up toward Highland, is basically the bluff, and so there's no opportunity for people to walk down and access the bus from there. And so we think that by going down to the rail spur, it really goes through the middle of where people are and where future activity is likely to continue, and that has some benefits. that rail spur, which actually runs all the way from downtown out to the Highland Bridge development, the former Ford site, would have to be acquired as part of this project. And you can see in green here the potential for a connection of a bicycle and pedestrian trail along that corridor for much of that corridor to make some really important connections for those modes of travel, especially biking, which can be tricky today along the West 7th corridor because there isn't really space for bikes on the street itself. And because of the angle, there really aren't other streets that go through. Um, Continuing on, we've got this yellow section in South Highland where, again, you start to, as you get closer to the Highway 5 bridge, this area has some of the higher traffic counts along West 7th. And that's in order to keep buses moving efficiently, we go back to the idea of needing a dedicated lane for buses in both directions in this section. And that would require that car travel go down to one lane in each direction with a center left turn lane. Again, I'll show you an image of what that could look like after this. We know that that will impact the current level of traffic in that section of West 7th. Some of that car traffic today, we hope, will end up being people who will ride the bus. We know that's not everyone, and some of that car traffic would probably choose different routes, such as Shepherd Road, or for longer trips, maybe things like 35E. Continuing west, as we leave St. Paul and cross the Highway 5 bridge, the bus would run on Highway 5. It would not be in dedicated space, we don't believe at this time, although we're going to explore possibly using the highway shoulders along Highway 5 to give the bus some time advantage when there is congestion. No conclusions, but an exploration will happen. The bus would go into Terminal 1 at the airport, as the 54 bus does today, come back out to Highway 5, and then continue west toward the Mall of America, where rather than going to the kind of congested intersection at 34th Avenue, the bus would cross 494 prior to that over to American Boulevard, again, in order to keep the bus moving and to save some time. So that's kind of the basic description of the end-to-end concept for the bus itself. Another view kind of shows you I mentioned dedicated lanes. So this view in red shows you where those lanes would be dedicated and where they wouldn't. So you got that kind of two-way dedication in some areas, one way for that long stretch potentially between Smith and 35E. No dedication on Highway 5 for the most part, unless we could use the shoulders, and then some little bits of dedication for some of the crossings that I mentioned. Overall, that would be 57% dedicated space along West 7th, and then 36% dedicated overall, because much less is dedicated outside of St. Paul. There would be 21 stations overall. 16 of those would be built new with this project. I mentioned those new Gold Line stations downtown would be utilized. There's also the existing bus station at the airport, for example. So talking beyond the bus, we know from lots of experience and feedback, people want to see other kinds of improvements along West 7th Street, from pedestrian safety improvements to greater accessibility, to trees and street furnishings, to just not having a street that's always filled with potholes. And we firmly agree with all of those things. And so this slide really just kind of gets at a whole slew of activities that we know we'll want to do along the street, but we're not at the level of detail of saying it will look like this on this block or that on this block. On the upper right here, kind of an important concept is that West 7th has many of these locations where streets intersect relatively close to one another that are otherwise east-west and north-south streets, leaving these smaller triangle parcels. And we think that there are opportunities in probably about 5 locations to consider blocking off car access to one of those streets or the other, and then using that space that cars can no longer go through for things like additional parking for business areas or for green space. And you can kind of see a combination of those things here. Okay, I mentioned the additional visuals. I'll kind of go through these quickly because I think I'm running a little bit behind schedule. But this shows you a view of what that Smith Avenue section could look like. So again, that pink section, which is shown over here on the left, buses in dedicated lanes in both directions. Emergency vehicles can also use those lanes. So we believe that this would actually be an improvement to emergency vehicle access in and out of the hospital, for example. But car travel would go down to one direction on that section of Smith with a left turn lane. To get those left-turning vehicles out of the way of traffic. This would prioritize buses and moving buses efficiently through one of the more congested parts of the corridor, as I mentioned before. Moving again westward along West 7th, you can see that section from Smith to 35E. We would have essentially kind of a 3-lane street for cars. And when I say 3-lane, that's like one lane of travel in each direction with a center left turn lane, where moving eastbound, the buses would be in mixed traffic, and moving westbound, you'd have this dedicated lane for buses here in pink. And then conceptually, we're showing the parking lane being on the north side of the street because in general, our observation is that there are more businesses dependent on kind of that in and out traffic of street parking on the north side than the south. But that's just an observation and not a firm conclusion about the location of parking. A view of the section where we would go down to the rail spur. Importantly, we've identified that the rail spur is wide enough to accommodate bus lanes in both directions and still have space for a multi-use trail alongside it in that section. You can kind of see that here. This gives you a sense of the new trail potential, again, from Highland Bridge, cutting through South Highland, and then kind of paralleling West 7th all the way up to this area near Randolph and Shepherd, where it could make some connections to other existing trails and bikeways. And then on the right here, showing that where the trail would cross West 7th itself, conceptually, we believe it would probably have a bridge over West 7th to avoid the conflicts with West 7th traffic. That would be about a 5-mile new trail connection. In the yellow section in South Highland, I mentioned earlier, dedicated bus lanes in both directions, that kind of 3-lane roadway for cars in the center. This is the same number of lanes that exist today in this area, just a different configuration. Where the stations would require a little bit of a widening of the corridor. And so in some very limited spots, we anticipate the need to take some slivers of land that are private today in order to make that work. No buildings, but some slivers of land. Continuing toward the Mall of America, just quickly, we've got this concept for jumping over 494 in an efficient way and avoiding some of the heavier traffic zones down in Bloomington. So that's kind of the concept. We are right here at the very beginning of this process in what we call project development. We anticipate project development taking about 2 years, this year and next approximately. Assuming that all of our partners want to continue to move forward, we would go into design and engineering, which would take another 2 to 3 years to get to that point of actually having construction documents. And then construction would last approximately 3 years. So if you're doing the math, the earliest construction could start would be about 2029, lasting about 3 years. That timeline happens to be very similar to MnDOT's planned street resurfacing work along West 7th, which is otherwise scheduled for 2028 and 2029. And so if this project moves forward, this would kind of supplant the resurfacing because it would be a more substantial investment in West 7th than just the resurfacing. Total budget estimate here is about $500 million. That's inclusive of the buses, the stations, the reinvestment in the street, kind of the purchase and installation of the space for the trail. All of that is included in that estimate. While it is preliminary, because of the level of study of this corridor over many years, we have a bit more confidence in this estimate than we might in some other locations. So just wrapping up here, all this information can be found at stpaul.gov/west7, and this is our preferred email address for communication about the project directly to the city. With that, I'm going to turn the mic back over to Sophia, who is going to moderate our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Russ. Just a reminder too, for any of the agency staff that'll be answering questions, is a good time to turn on your camera so people can see who is answering. And with that, we'll get into one of our first questions that was provided in the chat. And again, continue to add questions in the chat, or you can also raise your hand. The button's on the top of your screen. It says raise, it's a hand. So to start out with, we have a transit question, and it is, what determines the direction of the dedicated bus lane?
Yes, thanks for that question. So in looking, and my colleagues from Metro Transit can chime in and add here, of course, but in looking at the section between 35E and Smith, today there's a bit more delay typically in terms of traffic congestion in the westbound direction than the eastbound direction for the buses that operate there today. And so the idea here is to choose the direction where having the dedicated lane would best make the bus more efficient. In an ideal world, you give the bus dedicated space kind of everywhere, but we know that we have to balance that ideal with the other needs of the street, including street parking, space for pedestrians, etc.
Thanks so much, Russ. I see Metro Transit staff joining on camera as well. Jake, do you want to add?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jake Knight. I'm a planner at Metro Transit. Russ, I would echo everything you just said, and just say we make these decisions based on the data that we have, and would continue to evaluate this in the next phase to make sure that that initial assignment of direction still makes sense based on the latest data.
Thank you both. Moving on to our next question. Why doesn't the trail go all the way to St. Clair Avenue? And the commenter, Antonio, wants us to know that they are supportive of this bike improvement as shown.
Thanks for the question, Antonio. Yeah, so the map doesn't, again, this is conceptual. And so the reason that we wanted to make sure to go at least as far as the Randolph area is to make the connection to the Sam Morgan Trail along the river that then splits, as you probably know, to being a trail along Shepherd Road and the one that actually follows the river itself. And there are also some connections to be made there to the north, such as at Western Avenue. So no firm conclusion about exactly how far the trail should go. There's a, but there is a belief that going all the way to downtown might not be necessary because at some point it becomes redundant with some of those existing trails.
Thank you, Russ. I'm going to continue us on questions about the specifics of the infrastructure. And for those who are following along in the presentation, various sections of the map were highlighted in colors. And this commentator is asking about the orange section and wondering if the sidewalk width will change from what it is today.
Great question. So as a baseline assumption, we are assuming that we want to keep the sidewalks at least what they are today in terms of what we call the space behind the curb or between the curb and the building fronts. So we sometimes think of that as a combination of sidewalk and boulevard space. So that's kind of the baseline. We want for as much of the corridor as possible at least as much space as today. Certainly possible that at stations where there's more space needed for those stations, there could be some narrowing. But we know that in terms of trees being able to survive out there in tough conditions, at least that width is necessary. MnDOT did in the last couple of years take down some ash trees along West 7th that were diseased and needing to come down. And we know that fitting as many trees as possible into that space is a community goal that we share.
Thank you, Russ. Moving on to the topic of funding, we got a couple questions related to that, and I'll ask them together. Which is generally, I think, how are we funding this project? Both are we using federal funds, and do we expect participation from the counties such as Ramsey?
Yes, thank you for that question. So in terms of funding, nothing is set. This is conceptual. The plan, though, is to not go after a big federal grant for this project. Unlike some transitway projects that go to the Federal Transit Administration through the New Starts program or Small Starts, where the federal government would sometimes contribute up to 50% of the costs. Particularly during this federal administration, we see that as difficult, to say the least. And we believe that among the local partners, there is the potential for having enough resources to get this project done without making it federal. And that comes along with some ability to move a little bit faster. So in general, no plan to use federal money. And we certainly hope that our partners at Ramsey County would be part of the financial contribution to the project.
Moving us back to questions about the specifics of the infrastructure that might be designed. Going back to the presentation, thinking about the roundabout at Lexington and Montreal to the spur line, and wondering how we are going to do that, as the commenter notes that there's a lot of grade changes and steep slopes, especially as you get towards Glen Terrace Apartments.
Yeah, thank you. And this question has come up a couple of times now. We looked at this area very preliminarily and thinking about how to make that connection down to the rail spur. And so there's a couple of options, but there is a pretty significant grade change, as you mentioned. And so either the bus would have to fly over or ramp down, right? There's kind of two options there. A lot more analysis will be needed to determine what the best option might be. I should have mentioned and didn't that if we determine that that's too difficult, too expensive, doesn't make sense, there is still the option of keeping the bus along West 7th in this segment, even though we've determined that the rail spur would be preferable for some of the reasons that I mentioned.
Well, we've answered all the questions that are currently in the chat. We do have more time, so we'll kind of give folks a moment to think if they have any questions. Again, you can also, it's a great time if you want to raise your hand and unmute yourself. You can talk to us as well. Since Russ has the presentation open, we would also love for anybody that is with us today to make sure that you also take the survey, which is available online, and we'll just kind of prompt you now as well. We're taking feedback until May 4th. It's really great to hear from folks. So you heard about it, tell your neighbor about it, tell your friend to take the survey. Right now, you can use the QR code to pull out your phone if you're not already on it and use the QR code. Or again, this is linked directly on the city's website, West 7th website. And the 3 questions that we'd hope that you would answer are provided in this slide as well. Just kind of gauging your support for this concept and what you like or are concerned about, as well as any questions that you have. If you have the question, others might have the question, and it really helps us develop information and ensure that's online as well for folks that may be answering it. Okay, we have a few more questions coming in while we were chatting, so we'll go to those. And this one's an easy one. Will the presentation be available after this meeting? And when will the recording be available? This person was not able to log on. And I'll start off by saying that the presentation is online, and the recording will be up soon. Anything to add to that, Russ?
No, I was just going to go back to the URL slide for where to find the presentation online.
So St. Paul or stpaul.gov/West 7th for those that might be joining on your phone and not able to see the slides fully. Okay, next question. The bridge over I-35 would be broadened. Does that, picking up on the word that you said broaden, would that imply replacement, or what do we mean?
Yeah, so an early conversation with MnDOT and Sarah, I see popped on. It would not require the bridge to be fully rebuilt, but redecked in order to widen it. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
I was just gonna say, yeah, MnDOT has been taking a look at whether or not and when that bridge needs to be replaced anyways. So we'll kind of make that decision during construction, but if it needs to be replaced, it's not just because of this project. That is an older bridge that that if we're doing a complete rebuild of the corridor, we might take advantage of the construction closures and rebuild that as well.
Thanks, Sarah.
Next question, referring to the presentation, Russ, you talked about how some of the stub streets of those triangles might be changed to accommodate possible parking, and wondering what those ones might be. And the commentator also wanted to know that sounded like a good idea to explore.
Great, we appreciate that feedback. We should firm up this number, but I think there's about 5 of those locations along the corridor that leave those small triangle parcels. You probably know some of them and maybe haven't noticed some of the others. And so, when you think about kind of closing off one side and then using it for parking, one of the questions that comes up is, how do you plow that new parking for snow, given that it's sort of a dead end? And so operational questions like that will need to be thought through. We will start to map exactly where those locations are so that we have a better visual of that. But again, it's about 5 different spots. I think the example that we had up is where the old Tori Ramen that's now closed was along the West 7th corridor.
Anna, would you like to add to that?
I want to encourage people to, if you have a location where you think that could work really well and like you use that area frequently and you thought, hey, we don't need to have direct access to West 7th and there's a better use for this, that's a perfect comment to provide either in email, or you can talk to one of the staff here, or we do have a online map that is available at stpaul.gov/West7, where you can drop a pin. Like you could drop a pin at an exact location. You're like, this would be a great place for that solution.
Yeah. And this hasn't specifically come up with regard to this project yet, but one of the things that the city's been doing recently is investing in public electric vehicle charging. And so that's one of the things that could potentially be a need that could be provided if there were new parking spots like those.
Continuing our theme of kind of specific infrastructure questions, wondering if Montreal Way was considered to get to the spur without needing to transverse traffic on the 35E/West 7th bridge.
Yes, so we actually had a lot of conversation about this topic, and we looked at the potential of dipping down to the spur at Montreal Way. There couple of things there. Montreal Way, while there are some businesses down there, Summit Brewing and kind of that business Port Authority Business Development Center, does get you a little bit off of kind of the main thoroughfare for a section. The other issue is trying to serve all of the relatively dense housing in that area around West 7th and Lexington, some of it new there on the north side of the street, some of it existing on the south side, and like what's the best place to be to capture as many potential riders as possible is sort of the question that we're trying to answer in that section. So again, no firm conclusions, but those are the goals that we're trying to hit.
Going back to our conversation about potential parking triangles, wondering if St. Paul would retain ownership of the parking in that right of way, or is there consideration of private ownership or making these lots?
I would say at this stage in the conversation, all such options are on the table. I think, as I mentioned, there's some complexity to trying to remove snow on a short dead-end street, for example. One could think of ways to make that possible. So it could vary, honestly. It could be that the need in one location is really for some public parking. It could be that the biggest need in another location is for a little additional green space. And it could be that neither of those needs is that strong in a location, and some of that could potentially, be considered for sale to a private entity. So if you have ideas along those lines and specific needs, we would love to hear about them.
Thank you. And I'll note as well that we have some just general comments in the chat, just expressing support for this concept, that it's promising, and wishing us good luck. I would encourage folks to, if your comments are positive, send them in as well, right? It's helpful for us to understand what information is helpful for folks, and what you're really, when you look at the plan, you're like, oh yeah, that is right. I really want that. It helps us continue to make sure that we're moving in that direction to make this plan that is the best for the residents of St. Paul in our region. Okay, getting some more questions in the chat, and this one is turning us to development and how we would place stations. So taking into account future development or higher density, how is that informing some of the routing if it isn't already?
Yeah, so great question. It's certainly part of our thinking about using the rail spur so that the transit service can be as close to both existing development and potential future development as possible. The whole area is relatively built up, but in some areas there's more potential for redevelopment than others, to your point. The West 7th Corridor has had some rezoning over the years, but we would certainly take another look at the zoning along the corridor, and where appropriate, look for areas where higher densities would make sense and be allowed. That's a really important part of these projects overall, is that hopefully the transit investment also makes it appealing and attractive for more people, more businesses to be located in this area. And typically the only way to do that is to build up, because there's no more land being found.
So true. I think we have some more questions coming in, and or just a comment, which is they're happier that BRT is the direction versus streetcar, expressing that streetcar was way too expensive, and may have changed West 7th too much, and being excited about the direction. So appreciate those that continue to add to the conversation about their support regarding this direction. We are excited too to dive into it and to improve transit. And Switching back to the conversation about bikes and bike amenities. Has there been conversation to amend the bike plan and add bike lanes on West 7th?
Thanks for that question. I'm going to go back to kind of the big picture view of the corridor here. And so I'm guessing this question may be with regard to the parts of West 7th where the bus would not be. Because where the bus is planned to be on West 7th, there really wouldn't be space to add facilities for bikes as well, because there's just not enough space out there. However, for the section of West 7th where the bus is running on Smith, there potentially could be space to provide space for a bike connection on West 7th in that area. Same for the area down in South Highland between essentially, the Montreal-Lexington area and the St. Paul Avenue area. And so the question becomes, what's the best use of that space along West 7th? What are the bike connections that need to be made beyond the trail connection, et cetera? But one of the questions that has come up previously as well is, as long as West 7th is going to go down to one lane of traffic in each direction in the yellow section down in South Highland, it's hard to imagine that it would stay 2 lanes in each direction in the section between St. Paul Avenue and 35E, whether the bus was there or not. And so presumably that would create some space to work with for bike facilities or other needs.
Thanks for that detail, Russ. I'll note for folks, there's probably time for another question or two, depending on the length, before we kind of wrap things up at the end. We've currently answered all the questions that are in the chat. So kind of last call, folks. If you have any burning thoughts, even if you've already asked a question, you should feel free to ask another one. Any comments that you put into the chat, we are recording them. We're taking them in, and we'll document them as part of our engagement process right now. And again, for those that asked, the presentation is already online, so share it with your friends and neighbors or business colleagues. And then this recording will be online very, very soon. We also have another opportunity tomorrow night to come and talk with us. And that information is available online as well as in the, I think Russ is pulling it up as well. And okay, last question probably that has come in. We're continuing on the spur questions is, if the spur alignment is used, will the power line towers be replaced?
Gotcha. We don't believe that the use of the spur would require that the power lines be moved or touched. I'm not aware today of Excel having any specific needs to make changes there. So at this time, the answer is no.
And this is I think a question that we can answer pretty quick, and then I think it's might be our last one for this meeting today. Russ, would you mind going back to the schedule slide? The question is, would we be starting project development soon?
Yes, and so the answer is that we are already, this is part of project development. The concept development, your engagement around this concept. There will be sort of a wrap up of this phase of engagement over the next month or so, and then we will kind of bring all of the public agency parties back together and have a really important conversation about how we think we can move forward before entering into that design and engineering phase. And actually, even before continuing the project development phase, I should say.
Thank you for providing that extra detail. And I want to thank everybody for coming and providing your thoughts and asking your questions. Very, very helpful. We appreciate spending the time with you. Russ, turning it back to you to share any last thoughts and close us up for the day.
Thanks, Sophia, and thanks for your great facilitation of the meeting. Thanks for attending, everyone. We and our partners are really excited about this potential. One of the things that we keep hearing is that people want to see something happen soon, and we do too. So thanks for your engagement. Please stay engaged, and we look forward to further conversation down the line.